With a look back at the stories making headlines this week, I'm April Cummings.
While the crisis has far from passed, there is every reason to be optimistic for our future.
The Premier hits vaccines and the border as he spoke to members of the Cayman Islands business community. Radio Cayman's Carsley Fuller explains.
Speaking at the Chamber of Commerce's annual general meeting, the Honorable Alda McLaughlin told members the rollout of the vaccine is going well in Cayman, adding that the country can be confident that its population will have a great deal of protection against COVID-19. However,
changing circumstances mean that of necessity, today's plans must be flexible. With the arrival of new COVID-19 strains and concerns over how much protection the current vaccines will offer against these new variants, it has become increasingly challenging to develop a firm timetable to get the Cayman tourism economy up and running again.
As a result, Mr. McLaughlin says Cayman businesses will most likely have to wait until the end of the year before getting back to a more normal operation. And as for potentially reopening the border in March,
just a few weeks ago, I was relatively confident, given the plan that we had, that we would be able to reopen the borders, having had our people vaccinated by the end of March. The game has changed completely now. The scientists are far from certain that the vaccination will be effective against all of the many variants which are constantly being discovered.
The Premier says the country has come too far for the virus to re-enter the community and, quote, rip through these islands.
Given concerns with the new strains detected in travelers coming to Cayman, we must reassess. My caucus and cabinet are awaiting updated information on our current vaccination program and the situation with COVID-19, including the new strains, and the impact these will have on plans to reopen the border. Whilst we need to consider how best to further open up, any decisions taken will be done with safety and public health as the major considerations.
Government remains committed to finding a way to reopen the border as soon as possible safely. And Mr. McLaughlin says he's hopeful that Cayman will enjoy a, quote, improved stayover tourism high season as the country closes out 2021. Reporting for Radio Cayman News, I'm Carsley Fuller.
Late this week, the Premier announced changes to border control rules could soon be in place. Radio Cayman's Felicia Rankin-Solins has more on that.
Honorable Premier Alda McLaughlin says once the vaccination quota is met, quarantine for inter-island travelers will ease.
Cabinet, after consultation with the Chief Medical Officer, has agreed that once the 90% target for vaccinations for those older than 60, about 5,000 persons, has been reached, that the border controls can be changed to allow a quarantine period of 10 days for any traveler inter-islands who meets the following conditions.
Travelers must have had a negative PCR test within 72 hours prior to arrival, as well as a negative PCR test upon arrival in Grand Cayman.
They must have completed a valid vaccination program against COVID-19 as approved by the Chief Medical Officer, and they must be staying in a household where all persons have received a full course of vaccination. Members of the household who did not travel but who had the vaccination will not be required to quarantine.
Current figures show 55% of those older than 60 are now vaccinated.
We have about another 2,300 or so persons older than 60 to vaccinate to reach our 90% target. I again ask that everyone utilize the opportunity to get your vaccine when the HSA announces the availability of vaccines for whatever group you are in.
The Premier adds to make sure you return for your second vaccine dose. For Radio Cayman News, I'm Felicia Rankin-Solins.
Adults traveling with children, however, would need to continue the 14-day quarantine until children are eligible for vaccines. A negative PCR test is also required before being approved to leave quarantine. We also learned a third consignment of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccines would be headed our way next week.
This time we've been able to secure slightly more doses than the first and second consignment, so the next consignment will consist of around 15,000 doses.
During Thursday's COVID-19 briefing, His Excellency Governor Martin Roper explained each vial of the vaccine has 5 doses, but there is the possibility of getting 6 or 7 vaccines out of each vial of 5. He says there were a total of 23,000 doses in the first 2 batches. The third will take the country to a total of about 38,000, close to 20,000 people, 40% of the adult population.
So this is a really strong signal of support from the UK for Cayman and the overseas territories, And my office remains in touch with London about further supplies on the next 2 BA flights, which are at the end of February and the further one around the middle of March.
The consignment is due to arrive on the next British Airways Airbridge flight on February 11th. This week, the Elections Office published the revised Register of Electors. Radio Cayman's Dion Anglin explains.
Subject to objections or claims raised during the revision period, the list is the one that will be used in the next general election. The revised list contains of 23,647 voters, which represents an overall increase of 2,421 or 11.4% over the list used for the April 2017 general election. 1,406 new voters were added since January 1st. The electoral district of Newlands saw the highest increase in registered voters, 18.4% compared to April 2017, while Cayman Brac East revised register of electors reduced by 1.2% compared to April 2017. The supervisor of elections, Wesley Howell, gave heartfelt thanks to the district registering officers and the elections office team, who worked hard to process all applications and change of detail forms, with 506 new voter applications and 256 change of detail forms received on the final day of registration. Reporting for Radio Cayman News, I'm Dion Anglin.
We also saw the gazetting of a bill addressing specific issues related to mental health patients, including emergency detention orders and protective custody. Radio Cayman's Carsley Fuller has more.
The Mental Health Amendment Bill 2021 is the first bill published this year, and if passed, it will amend the Mental Health Act 2013 to clarify the procedure relating to emergency detention orders, provide for orders for protective custody, and allow restrictions on access to electronic networks by patients. For example, Clause 4 of the bill proposes a new subsection for the existing mental health law relating specifically to protective custody. Quote, if a medical officer is of the opinion that a person is or may be suffering from a mental impairment or serious mental illness, the officer may make an order for protective custody in the prescribed form, directing a constable to A, take the person into protective custody, and B, with all reasonable dispatch, but no later than 12 hours after the person has been taken into protective custody, bring the person before a medical doctor to be examined. The proposed new subsections also clarify the procedure relating to emergency detention orders, which can provide for the detention of the person in a hospital or other place of safety for up to 72 hours. Clause 8 of the bill replaces the existing Act Section 16, keeping the current provisions on postal restrictions in the Principal Act, but factoring in recent technological advances in the use of electronic networks. So if a medical officer is of the opinion that access to any electronic network may have an adverse effect on the patient, that access can be denied, a decision that could then be reviewed by the Mental Health Commission within 7 days if the patient or a near relative appeals it. Reporting for Radio Cayman News, I'm Carsley Fuller.
You can find the full amendment bill online at legislation.gov.ky. And a bit of sports now. Cayman Islands national athlete Shalisa Ray now holds the 6th fastest 400-meter time ever run by a female competing out of Kansas State University.
It makes me feel great, especially because I do also hold the title for the 7th best 60 meters. So I'm just really grateful that I was able to accomplish such titles so early on in the season.
The 21-year-old KSU sophomore ran the 400-meter at her school's DeLoss Dodds Invitational Indoor Meet, where she won first place with a new personal best of 54.06. Ray tells Radio Cayman Sports her performance granted her the current honor of being the 4th fastest 400-meter female runner in the Big 12 Conference so far this year. That is a look back at the stories making headlines this week. From Radio Cayman's newsroom, I'm April Cummings.